So we're going to have a brief history lesson of chemistry up until the point of the material that we've talked about so far. We're going to talk about Dalton, and we're going to talk about some of our laws that define our compounds. So we're going to use a timeline to kind of guide our discussion, and our timeline starts all the way back between 492 BC and 432 BC. That was where we met a scientist named Empedocles, and Empedocles was the first person to use the word element. And he said that there were 4 elements, and his elements were earth, fire, wind, and water. Those were his 4 elements. In the range of 460 BC to 432 BC, we meet Democritus, and he was the first person to use the word atom. He actually used the word atomos, which means indivisible, and he said that everything is comprised of these indivisible particles. We're going to make a huge jump in our timeline from 432 BC all the way up to 1660, and that's where we meet Robert Boyle. And Robert Boyle was the first person to use the word element as we use it today, and he said that elements are fundamental substances that cannot be broken down any farther. So that's our present definition of an element. Jump to 1773, and we meet Joseph Priestley. Priestley was the first scientist to do studies that determined that some compounds, some substances, can be broken down into smaller pieces. He didn't know what they were. We didn't know what they were until 1775. That's where Anton Lavoisier comes in, and he took Priestley's experiments. Priestley was experimenting on water, and he said that those 2 mystery gases were actually oxygen and hydrogen. Lavoisier is also the person who came up with our law of conservation of mass that we talked about at the beginning of the semester. Later on in the late 1700s, we meet Joseph Proust, and Proust came up with our law of definite proportions, and he said that reactions happen in defined proportions, and we're going to talk about that law more here in a couple minutes. In 1803, we meet John Dalton, and Dalton came up with what is considered our first atomic model. So he was the first person to use the atom in the terms that we've used it so far in this class, and he had 4 pieces. He said that matter is composed of atoms, so everything is made up of these particles called atoms. He said that all atoms for a specific element are identical, so all hydrogen atoms are identical, all sodium atoms are identical. He said that reactions involved combining and recombining atoms, not creating new ones, not breaking apart atoms. He said it's all about atoms breaking apart from other atoms and then recombining with other atoms. And then finally, he said that they reacted in defined whole number ratios, and that's what we call our law of multiple proportions. In 1810, we meet Amedeo Avogadro, and we're going to talk about his work here next class, where we talk about relative mass in the mole. So he came up with how to actually count these particles. So just so that everybody is on the same page, we're going to run through kind of our basic definitions of our now language of chemistry. So the first thing that we want to define is an element, and we say that elements are substances made from only one type of atom, so that was from Dalton, that cannot be broken down any further. So atoms are the smallest particles that we have. At this point, our atoms have no internal structure. An atom, then, is a single unit of an element. So an element is more of a type of atom, and the atom is the actual small piece. We then say that a compound is a single unit comprised of 2 or more different elements combined together. So water is a compound, where we have 2 hydrogens and an oxygen combined together to make a unit, a compound of water. We've been using the word particle a lot in this class, and now our expansion of the definition, now we can expand our definition of a particle. We can say that it's a single unit of a substance, and that single unit can either be an atom, or it can refer to a compound. So we can say we can have a particle of water, or we can have a particle of hydrogen. Particle of hydrogen would be an atom. Particle of water would be the compound. We've also talked about pure substances and mixtures. So we discovered that a pure substance is something that contains only one type of particle. And so we can have pure elements, and we can also have pure compounds, because we talk about having pure hydrogen, we talk about having pure oxygen. Those would be pure elements. We can also talk about having pure water. That would be a pure compound. A mixture then is the opposite. It contains more than one type of particle. So we can have a mixture of elements. In our lab, we had a mixture of sulfur and iron. Those were both elements. We can also have a mixture of compounds. We mixed water with salt. So this is the formula for salt. We'll talk about that later. And so both of these are compounds. They contain more than one type of atom. Mix them together and we have a mixture of compounds. We can also make a mixture of elements in compounds. If we were to take some of the iron from our lab and mix it with water, that would make a mixture of an element and a compound. As I mentioned before, we have two laws that govern what our compounds can become. So the first one is our law of definite proportions, and that law says that samples of a compound will always have the same composition, or the same mass percent of an element or a ratio. So those are things we can calculate. We can calculate the mass percent of the different elements in a compound. An example of this is that water, we know the formula is H2O, all samples of water will have a ratio of 2 to 1 for the hydrogen to oxygen. If it doesn't, it's no longer water. In order for it to be water, it has to be in that 2 to 1 ratio. That's the law of definite proportions. The law of multiple proportions talks about if two elements can combine to make two different types of compounds. So if two elements combine to form more than one compound, the ratios of the elements will be small and whole number ratios. So they're going to be as small as they can be, and they're always going to be whole numbers. So for example, carbon and oxygen can combine to make many different types of compounds. We're going to focus on two of them. If we have a 1-to-1 ratio of carbon and oxygen, we call that carbon monoxide. A completely different ratio, a 1-to-2 ratio of the carbon and oxygen makes carbon dioxide. Carbon monoxide is poisonous. Carbon dioxide is what we breathe out. So two very different substances involved with the same elements, but they form the compounds in different small whole number ratios.